Hi, and welcome to my channel. My name is Brittany, and we are going to start a Bible in a year journey. This is going to be really exciting. So we are going to read from Genesis to Revelation in 1 year. I'm going to have a schedule somewhere posted on the channel, maybe in the description of this video, but the goal is to try to stay consistent, to grow spiritually, to develop some discipline. So I hope you'll find this to be really exciting. A few things that I think we should be mindful of as we're reading the Bible. So the first thing will be the 3 applications of scripture. So the 3 applications are the historical application, the prophetic or doctrinal application, and the devotional application. So the historical application is the understanding that as we're reading scripture, we believe that everything that we're reading happened at some point in time in history to real people. So these are real events that took place at some point in time in history to real people. The doctrinal or prophetic application. So doctrine means teaching, and prophetic is pointing to something future. So it's talking about something that has not happened yet, something that will happen. So the prophetic application is the understanding that when we're reading certain parts of scripture, specifically in the Old Testament, that these verses can apply to something that has not happened yet. For example, there are scriptures in the Old Testament that all point to Christ. Even though he had not been born yet in history, there are verses where we can see Christ all throughout the Old Testament scripture. The devotional application is one that I think most people are familiar with. So this is when we're approaching scripture, we want to think about how can we apply this to our lives? How does this apply in my day-to-day situations? What does this verse mean for me? That is the devotional application. So that's the first thing I want us to be mindful of. The next thing as we're reading scripture that I think will be helpful to be mindful of is the theme of the Bible. So the theme of the Bible, again, kind of how I just hinted at, the entire Bible is about a future time where Jesus Christ is ruling and reigning on the throne. So again, there will be key words or phrases that are used throughout scripture, even in the Old Testament, that point to this future period in time. So even though we may be reading a story about a specific person or a specific topic, it stands to reason that that story or that person could be pointing to this prophetic time known as the millennium or the millennial reign, where Jesus Christ is ruling and reigning on earth. The next 2 things I want us to keep in mind is that the Bible is actually not an American book, and most of the Bible was not even written to Christians. Let me explain. So when I say that the Bible is not an American book, I think this is a helpful perspective to take, because a lot of Americans, when we read any literature in our country, we always expect there to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. We have a linear mindset, but actually the rest of the world tends to have a cyclical way of thinking. So things are all interconnected. Everything is woven together. Whereas from that American perspective, we expect things to happen in chronological order, all at one time and in the proper order. But as we're reading scripture, we'll notice that some things are happening out of order. Reading the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is actually not the chronological way to read scripture. So we'll notice some things may be happening and they seem out of order. And that's why I want us to keep that perspective in mind as we're reading scripture. It can get really confusing if you're expecting things to happen in this concrete order. And what I mean when I say that the Bible is actually not written to Christians, most of scripture was actually written specifically to the Jews. But that does not mean that all scripture can't be helpful for Christians. The entire Bible can be helpful and is for Christians, but it's not necessarily addressed to Christians. There are specific books in the Bible that are specifically to Christians or specifically to the church. And those will be the books of Romans through Philemon. These are letters that are addressed specifically to churches or Christians following Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection. But again, that doesn't mean that all scripture is not for Christians. So let me explain this difference between 2 and 4. The way my teacher explained it to me is that, let's say my grandmother, a very successful businesswoman, passes away, and before she passes away, she writes me a letter giving me the steps that she used to become a successful businesswoman. So she's explaining to me, these are the steps you need to follow if you want to be a millionaire as well. So she says, "Dear Brittany, step 1, step 2, step 3," tells me exactly what to do. At the end of the letter, she says, "Here is $500,000. I'm enclosing a check for you so that you can get started." Now, let's say I save that letter, I leave it on my desk, I have a friend over, she sees the letter on my desk, reads the letter, she sees that step-by-step process for how to become a successful businesswoman. Now, it would not make sense for my friend to then approach me and say, "Okay, Brittany, where's the check?" That check was not to her. that check was addressed to me. However, those steps on how to build a successful business can be helpful for her. She can use those steps. She can become a successful businesswoman. I can use those steps. I can become a successful businesswoman. The difference is the promise in the letter of an enclosed check for $500,000 was to me. So the instructions in the letter were helpful for my friend, but that letter was not actually written to her, which means those promises were not to her, they only apply to me. And I think that's a helpful mindset to have as we're approaching scripture, because if we're reading things and trying to take promises that don't necessarily apply to us, that can cause us to move in a way throughout life that we really weren't meant to, because the promises that we're holding on to or the laws that we're trying to abide by weren't even to us, they were to the Jews. And the last thing that I want us to be aware of as we approach this Bible in a Year journey is that we will be comparing scripture with scripture. So even though we may be in Genesis 1, it is not uncommon for me to bounce all the way to Revelation to show some comparisons between what we're reading or to gain more clarity and context about what we're reading. I know a lot of people like to use commentaries, and I think they can be helpful at times, but I would really like to encourage everybody to practice comparing scripture with scripture to gain more insight into what we're reading. For example, in the Bible, we see a character, an animal, a sea creature called Leviathan. And if you look up who Leviathan is or what Leviathan is in commentaries, you can see a range of responses, from Leviathan being a hippo to some archaic creature or a representation of all of Israel's enemies. But the amazing thing about the Bible is if you just compare a few different scriptures, I'm pretty sure it's like 2 or 3 that you can compare, we actually get a concrete definition of who Leviathan is. So if you stick with us throughout this year, I hope that I'll get to show you some exciting things. I hope that you enjoy comparing scripture with scripture, understanding the different applications of the Bible, paying attention to that prophetic application, and getting some insight into the meaning behind and why the Old Testament can be valuable even to Christians. Even though it's not specifically to us, the entire Bible is certainly for us. So I hope you'll enjoy joining me on this journey. Make sure you get the schedule so that you know where we're at each day, and then Lord willing, each week I will be uploading a video just to summarize what we read throughout that week. So I believe the first video that you see should be Genesis chapter 1 through 12. So get that reading done throughout this coming week, and I will upload that first video for you. I'll see you soon. Grace and peace.